Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of March 20th, 2022. Today, we have an extremely important discussion for you because, unfortunately, we are living in the most dangerous period of time in my lifetime, at the very least, and I would say most likely in the entire history of humanity. Because of the terrible war between Russia and Ukraine, the world, unfortunately, is experiencing an elevated risk of nuclear war and the consequent destruction of the human species. And the third core ideal of the United States Transhumanist Party is that the U.S. Transhumanist Party supports the use of science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate the existential risks facing the human species. So any efforts to avert the great calamity that could arise if this war escalates would be greatly welcomed by the U.S. Transhumanist Party. And today we have a distinguished panel joining us. We have a number of our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our legislative director, Jason Geringer. We have our director of visual art, Art Ramon Garcia. We have our director of scholarship, Dan Elton. And we have Edward Hudgens, who is our member and the founder of the Human Achievement Alliance. And our special guests today bring a wide range of insights and backgrounds and experience to this conversation on existential risk. We have Newton Lee, who is the chairman of the California Transhumanist Party and who also is the editor of the Transhumanism Handbook, which is one of the most extensive and comprehensive compilations of transhumanist thinking. I highly recommend this book for everyone. We have David Pearce, the famous transhumanist philosopher and co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association. We have David Wood, entrepreneur from the smartphone industry and now a leading futurist who chairs the London Futurists and holds discussions on a variety of topics, including existential risk. And we have Kyrtin Atreides, who is part of the Uplift development team. He is an expert in artificial intelligence and in particular mediated artificial super intelligence. So we are really pleased to have this wide variety of panelists and possible suggestions for how we deal with this crisis. And I'll lay out the crisis very briefly. I think most of you in the audience are already aware that on February 27th, 2022, 3 days after his invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, very bluntly stated that Russia is a nuclear power and the West should be very careful about any actions taken in Ukraine because Russia does have this nuclear capacity and has the ability to essentially launch a nuclear strike if provoked by the West. And what is harrowing about this declaration is that not even during the peak of the Cold War, when tensions were at an all-time high between the United States and the Soviet Union, did the leaders of either side overtly threaten nuclear war. Indeed, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when one could argue humanity came closest to a nuclear exchange prior to this time, there were far more extensive and concerted and good faith efforts at negotiation. John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev exchanged written correspondence, detailed written correspondence personally with one another in an effort to negotiate and avert this crisis. We have seen no attempts at such direct negotiation between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin, and I would say that is a problem that both of them bear some culpability for. Now, we have seen some salutary restraint from Joe Biden's administration and from the leadership of NATO in refusing to implement a so-called no-fly zone over Ukraine. And a no-fly zone is essentially a euphemism for NATO planes, including possibly American planes, shooting down any Russian planes over Ukrainian territory, which would be direct military hostilities and would escalate into World War III, as the political leadership of the NATO countries rightly recognizes. The problem that we have is that often the general public within the NATO countries seems to be far more enamored of the no-fly zone concept than the leadership. And indeed, there are some polls suggesting that 70+% of the American public have expressed some sort of support for establishing a no-fly zone over Ukraine, even though when it's explained to them that a no-fly zone means direct hostilities with Russia, that number tends to fall to around 35%, but still more than a third of the American public believes that it may be justified to engage in direct hostilities with Russia, even at the risk of nuclear war. So what is troubling, and what I think can greatly escalate the existential danger to humanity, would be the push from the largely uninformed general public, people who have no idea about the real geopolitical situation and wouldn't have been able to identify Ukraine on the map a few weeks prior to the war, essentially being willing to risk nuclear war because they're outraged at the terrible treatment of civilians, the destruction, the casualties that have occurred. So we have a situation where the conflict needs to be de-escalated urgently. And at the same time, the deaths in Ukraine and the suffering in Ukraine and the property destruction, the infrastructure damage in Ukraine also need to end as soon as possible. So how do we untie or cut through this Gordian knot? Well, this is what our panel today will hopefully shed some light on. And first, I'd like to invite Newton Lee to offer some thoughts on this crisis. Newton, you've prepared some slides. Please feel free to begin your presentation.
I would like to share some ideas with you. So first of all, I believe that transhumanism #1 priority should be world peace. I have visited Ukraine before the war. I've met people who are still in Ukraine today, and some of them are actually living in the subway bomb shelters. They are optimistic, but they need our help. So my 501c3 nonprofit IFERS is partnering with US and international organizations to provide food, shelter, medicine, and scholarships to the refugees in Moldova, Poland, and Romania. So the picture on the top shows the women and children that we safely transported from Ukraine to Poland. And I have employees in Moldova who are also assisting the refugees. They told me that they could actually hear bomb explosions in the neighboring country, Ukraine. Here are a number of things that we're doing to help the refugees, and it's really a daily nonstop operation. I'm constantly on WhatsApp talking to my teams on the ground, working really hard. And a journalist took some pictures on the ground. And we are also building shelters for the refugees and delivering supplies to the shelters to help them. In addition, we have 2 universities joining us by giving scholarships to Ukrainian college students, Tel Aviv University in Israel and Vincennes University in Indiana. We, of course, we also accept donations, and we have one-to-one matching, which is provided by an investment firm in London. We also accept cryptocurrencies, and my nonprofit is offering one-to-one matching donations for 5-1 coin. 5-1 coin is special crypto for nonprofit missions only. So back to transhumanism, number 1 priority, like Gennady mentioned, world peace is absolutely essential. And we remember that Julian Huxley was the founder and the first general director of UNESCO. And UNESCO's aim is to promote world peace and security through international cooperation in education, art, sciences, and culture. And if you look at what he wrote, essentially he's talking about the human species. We need to transcend ourselves as humanity and its entirety, meaning that we have to work together as people on Earth. Not only one nation, not only one group of people, but everybody has to work together. He said that he believed in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that, then the human species will be on threshold of a new kind of existence. Not existence that we are afraid and scared of World War III, not an existence that we fight against each other, but existence that we can actually fully be in peace with one another. So, as Gennady mentioned, the Transhumanism Handbook, I have over 70 transhumanists helping put together this book. And I believe that transhumanism can achieve world peace and security through international cooperation in education, arts, sciences, and culture. Now, the problem here is that not everybody believes in transhumanism. So how can we prevent wars and stop this disruption of international cooperation? I would say that the answer lies in total information awareness, which is another an important concept. So here's some quotes from the book. War is basically a legitimized state-sponsored terrorism in a grand scale. Okay, it's basically terrorism. So as we work on counter-terrorism, we are actually working on anti-war. Okay, the idea behind total information awareness is that the more information the countries and peoples have about each other, the better and safer the world will become. In fact, total information awareness has helped to stabilize relations among international powers. And to that end, espionage is actually making the world a safer place. Now, here lies the problem. There's a serious breakdown of intelligence assessment among Russia, Ukraine, EU countries, and the United States. And we need to fix the problem. So here's a logo for the campaign for nuclear disarmament badge back in the 1960s. And I look forward to more discussions with everybody here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Newton. And I greatly appreciate your remarks, including the excellent humanitarian work that IFERS has been doing for the refugees in Ukraine, because, as I've stated, alleviating the human suffering from this tragedy should be the foremost priority. And in my view, it is not the military means that would be the most effective in alleviating that suffering, but rather precisely the humanitarian means, getting help directly to the innocent civilians who are affected by this crisis, and also helping them to emigrate, to leave the conflict zones. So I think one policy priority for all Western governments should be to accept as many Ukrainian refugees as they can accommodate, because that relieves a lot of the pressure from the conflict, and it also addresses the public pressure for Western governments to do something about it. And I think the most effective actions that can be taken are ones that help people rather than contribute to the destruction. And thank you also for mentioning nuclear disarmament. It is a key policy priority of the US Transhumanist Party. I would encourage everyone to take a look at the US Transhumanist Party platform sections on addressing existential risks, and in particular to study articles 3 and 4, which discuss the dangers of certain technologies, in particular nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, as well as the importance of nuclear disarmament. And before we continue with the panel discussion, I would like to read section 4 of the US Transhumanist Party platform, because I do think that it frames this conversation in numerous important ways. Section 4 reads as follows: in recognition of the dire existential threat that nuclear weapons pose to sapient life on Earth, including as a result of such weapons' accidental deployment due to system failures or human misunderstanding, the United States Transhumanist Party advocates the complete dismantlement and abolition of all nuclear weapons everywhere as rapidly as possible. If necessary for geopolitical stability, synchronized multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation treaties should be pursued, strengthened, and accelerated in the most expeditious manner. If, however, multilateral agreements among nations are not reached, then the United States Transhumanist Party advocates that all nuclear powers, especially the United States and Russia, should undertake unilateral nuclear disarmament at the earliest opportunity in order to preserve civilization from accidental annihilation. Indeed, I think if nuclear weapons did not exist, then there would not be a risk of what is essentially a local conflict, the war between Russia and Ukraine. And there have been numerous wars that have been waged in that part of the world historically. Every century there have been several wars in that particular part of the world, but none of them threatened to destroy humanity until now, and that is because nuclear weapons exist now, whereas they did not exist during any of those prior wars. So with that having been said, I would like to turn the floor over to David Pearce for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Gennady. Yes, desperately depressing news, but just because the situation is terrible doesn't mean to say that it couldn't get 10,000 times worse. And yes, nuclear war would be unimaginably dreadful. Unfortunately, yeah, what does it actually mean to be human? Natural selection designed coalitions of human male primates to wage territorial wars of aggression against other coalitions of human male primates. Most of the wars of the past 2 centuries have been, at least in part, caused by nationalism. And this century, unless naively we have somehow abolished the ability to war, yeah, nation states are going to wage war, and it is highly likely that nuclear weapons will be used, whether tactical, theater, or strategic nuclear weapons, goodness knows. But yes, even if somehow we can resolve the conflict in the Ukraine, and perhaps there is the germ of a potential settlement that we can be discussing. Nonetheless, as long as we have heavily armed nuclear powers, and as long as we have wars, it is highly likely that this century is going to witness catastrophic war. Now, how can this be avoided if it really is part of the male human behavioral phenotype to wage wars of aggression? I've thought about it, like many people, I've thought, about world peace. Some potential solutions essentially are just, completely utopian. For example, all female governments, just as no coalitions of female chimpanzees ever wage territorial wars of aggression. Likewise, if we were to elect all female political leadership, there would no longer be territorial wars of aggression. But this is not a viable solution. And the solution I do favor, and perhaps we can discuss it later, I think in the long run, we need to be working towards world government, democratically elected world government with a monopoly on the use of force. That just as 50 states in the USA essentially acknowledge that the federal government has a monopoly on the use of force and the rule of law, in the long run, the only way to prevent catastrophic nuclear war is for nation states essentially to secede a monopoly on the use of force to a democratically elected United Nations. Now, goodness knows the practicalities. I mean, we can chat about this kind of thing later if anyone is interested. There are obviously horrendous risks to having world government, but and this is my pessimistic thought, that most world government is most likely to occur in the aftermath of a catastrophic nuclear war in which hundreds of millions and possibly even billions of people die. And I fear that we are sleepwalking to Armageddon. That transhumanists on the whole tend to be optimists. And yes, so personally, I have an incredibly naively optimistic view of the future of life in the universe. I imagine future life being based on gradients of superhuman bliss. But sadly, I see nuclear war as highly likely this century, and we need to be exploring imaginative solutions to prevent it. Much more to be said, but rather than say anything more now, I'm going to pass the baton over.
Yes, thank you very much to David Pearce for those remarks. And for anybody who is interested, please take a look at the most recent Virtual Enlightenment Salon that we held with David Pearce on November 7th, 2021, where we discussed some of these ideas in greater detail, including the idea of the possibility of all female leadership. And that's an interesting idea. I would say perhaps all female leaders, with the exception of Hillary Clinton, might have a lower risk of launching a nuclear war, but that's my own position on this. The thoughts about world government are interesting. Certainly transhumanism transcends national boundaries and transcends the ideologies of nationalism that get us into this kind of trouble where we have existential risk from nuclear war. So if we didn't have the concept of a nation state or nationalistic ideologies driving the territorial ambitions of nation states, then how much safer could the world be? And could we achieve nuclear disarmament at that point in time? I would hope so, but how do we get from here to there? That's a tricky question, certainly, to address. I'd be interested in any future thoughts in this regard. Now, let us go to David Wood for his comments on this important set of issues.
Many thanks for the invitation to be here. I will try to build on top of the very useful and inspiring opening remarks by Newton Lee and David Pearce. This is a terrible situation in many ways. We are all relatively comfortable taking part in this call, but as we are comfortable, there are people all over Ukraine facing risks of death, starvation. The people in Mariupol who were sheltering in theaters or in art galleries have been attacked by bombs. And it's not just the people in Ukraine who are in a terrible circumstance. The Russian soldiers are, in many cases, utterly bewildered. They had no idea what they were getting into. They were sent in without adequate supplies, without adequate information. It's incredibly distressing for them and for their parents. And there are people in Russia who have very hard, practical decisions to make. They want, in some cases, to speak out against this war, but they risk being sent to prison for many years if they do so. This is not something comfortable for them. Even the brave TV presenter who held up the sign on Russian Channel 1 now says her son bitterly complains to her, "Mom, you have made our lives a ruin because of what you have done." These are hard dilemmas that they are all suffering. And I hesitate to offer armchair advice, but I think we should dig into the insights that transhumanism can offer. The first insight that transhumanism offers is, much as David Pearce said, the human nature is not ideally suited to today's world. Our emotions are often dysfunctional in that they lead us into tribes and gangs. They lead us to tell lies against people outside our group and to feel strange and terrible loyalty to our in-group. It's also our thinking that leads us astray. Many of our shortcuts in thinking, many of our heuristics lead us astray when facing the terrible challenges of technologically driven war. Many of our instincts will actually cause us into making matters worse. We may think we are trying to make peace more likely, but if we are misled, we could sadly make the very thing we fear more likely to come. Instead of getting the peace we want, we could trigger the nuclear war that we are trying to avoid. So here's one example in which our instincts mislead us. Actually, a world in which all nuclear weapons were removed could be even more dangerous than today's world. How so? If there were tensions arising, there would be a great race for one group to reassemble its nuclear weapons and use them as a first strike before the other side could build its defenses back up. So paradoxically, a world in which there is mutual assured destruction, so-called MAD, has been more stable, has been more peaceful, despite many terrible local conflicts, than a world in which, if nuclear weapons had been disassembled and then countries that were strongly opposed to each other might be then in a terrible rush to reassemble them. So just getting rid of the nuclear weapons will not lead us into a world without nuclear war. Sadly, we need to change human relationships before that can happen. It's not the nuclear weapons themselves that are going to explode. Well, that's not quite true. There are some situations in which there could be accidental nuclear war, but it is a human factor that's heavily involved too. It's a bit like another controversial discussion, control of guns. Why are there so many gun crimes in some countries like America? Some people say, well, it's because there are too many guns. There should be more control over them. Others say, with some reason, the problem is people who are mentally ill or who are vindictive or who are desperate, who are depressed. They get a hold of the guns. It's the human access that is the cause of the danger. And I would say the existential risk that we are facing today in 2022 is not just nuclear weapons, it's the combination of Vladimir Putin and nuclear weapons that is causing the danger. And if we want to avoid the risk of nuclear weapons, we should not take Vladimir Putin at his word. He is a masterful liar. He has deployed lie after lie many times throughout history. He lied when Russia first moved into the Ukraine in 2014, saying, no, there's no Russians there, or there might be a few volunteers, but there's nothing official. He lied about the missile that knocked the Malaysian airliner out of the sky. He lied about the plans for invading Ukraine. He had troops all around and said, no, there's no invasion planned. So we must be careful not to take Vladimir Putin at his words. And of course, he wants us to think that he might be launching nuclear weapons. That is very much into his advantage if we think that and we stand back. I think, on the contrary, the safest way to get rid of this existential threat, to quote a very ancient maxim, if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. I don't mean that we should actually escalate, but I mean that we should think carefully. It is a good thing that Western countries supplied weapons to the people in Ukraine that they have been able to deploy effectively. It is a good thing that Western countries have also given a great deal of intelligence to the Ukrainians. They have been therefore able to fight back, and they have stopped Putin from steamrolling his way all over Ukraine, taking control of that, and being ready then for the next thing that he has made quite clear is his long-term ambition. Reassemble much of the Soviet Union. He has said clearly that he thinks it's the worst geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He has said on many occasions he wishes to take back control of what the Russians call the near abroad. So we should not allow our fears to misguide our thinking. We have to think very carefully and very thoughtfully, and I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to do that in this event. One more thought. Another transhumanist principle is look for the root cause. When there is a humanitarian crisis, of course, we should applaud those like Newton who are sending resources. My wife and I gave a considerable supply to be taken by somebody from our local district into Ukraine. Of course, we should all do that kind of thing. But the root cause is not that there is a lack of sufficient clothing and medicine and foods. The root cause is this too much power has gone into a single entity, that is the Russian regime under Vladimir Putin. The transhumanist insight is that we need openness. And the things that are closed, things which control all the information flow, as the Russian regime tries to do, that's where the real dangers are. So I applaud Newton when he says, let's have more total information awareness. And we must ensure that we never again get into a situation when powerful leaders such as Vladimir Putin control a country so much that all democratic opposition is disallowed, and anybody who speaks out against it, who even dares to call it an invasion, may go to prison. So that is not an acceptable situation. So in the future, what I see coming out of this could be a very positive turn of events. Just like after the Second World War, the nations of the world did many good things with the creation of the United Nations, with the Marshall Plan initiative, in which America magnanimously supported the rebuilding of Western Europe and similarly supported the rebuilding of Japan. They set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the Bretton Woods institutions. Something similar can come out of this terrible circumstance. And what I say is the United Nations is not going to be effective so long as there are autocratic regimes in there. So what I think is going to happen is the G7 is going to expand. Democratic countries, countries that are truly committed to democracy. Of course, they're not perfect by any means, but there is a vast difference between the democracy in most of the Western countries and the sham democracy practiced in Russia. So we may have the D12 or the D20 and then the D50. These democratic countries will increasingly, I believe, shun those like Russia who turn their back on the principles of openness and free exchange. And with that kind of pressure, I think we will take away the power of these regimes. And very importantly, we will inspire a regime change inside Russia. Russia have had regime changes in the past. When Khrushchev was perceived after the Cuban Missile Crisis to be too much of an unpredictable loose cannon, Brezhnev stepped in and replaced him and provided much more stability. And after Stalin died, Russia's control was temporarily in the hands of a brutal tyrant called Laurent Beria, but the other members of the leading Politburo turned on him and removed him from power. You can see that story, by the way, in the fascinating film Death of Stalin, which, whilst it is a comedy in some ways, it is very informative too. So I think that is what we should look to. The democratic countries of the world put pressure, economic sanctions, and so on against Russia, and lead it to the many men and women of good intention in Russia to remove Putin from power. And that is the best solution to the dilemma we are facing.
Yes, thank you, David, for those comments. And we have quite a bit of reaction from the audience as well. Mike Lazine writes, Putin is putting so many lives in jeopardy, even his own people. Some of the Russian soldiers are not for the war with Ukraine, and yet they're dying because of Putin. Zach Richardson, our director of publication, points out we can prevent psychopaths from gaining power by helping others see the benefits of humanism and spread these ideas to as many people as possible. So hopefully this conversation will contribute at least somewhat to that aim, and the more widely you, our viewers, spread it, the more effective it will be in this regard. Rudy Hoffman writes, unfortunately, that this Ukrainian issue has been like a slap in the face to his general outlook that humanity is past medieval thinking. He says, I guess we're not as evolved as I had thought and hoped. And that is the frightening reality that we see before us, unfortunately, which does tend to escalate with time and pose risks to the very existence of our species. Now, I think the comments you made are very interesting and worth considering, David, with regard to what would happen if nuclear weapons are abolished and dismantled. And you think the moment there's another escalation in geopolitical tensions, countries will race to redevelop nuclear weapons and build them back up. And the US Transhumanist Party platform in Article 3, in Section 3, acknowledges that we cannot unlearn the knowledge utilized in the creation of such technologies. However, the US Transhumanist Party holds that all such knowledge should only be devoted toward peaceful, life-affirming, rights-respecting purposes going forward. So what could happen in such a hypothetical situation where the knowledge of how to build nuclear weapons still exists? There are no actual nuclear weapons. How would we prevent existential risk to the human species from arising? I think the solution may be in highly effective missile defense systems. I think Ronald Reagan was onto something with his Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI, even though it was quite unfairly derided by the American left at the time, and it was certainly strongly opposed by the Soviet Union and then opposed by Putin. I think if the United States shifted its strategic focus toward missile defense rather than aggressive nuclear capabilities, we could avert the existential risk scenario that you described of nations striving to rearm after a general nuclear disarmament. Because if the US had the best missile defense systems built up over decades, I think they would be several steps ahead of any nations that strive to rearm. My fundamental ethical problem with nuclear weapons is that they are inherently indiscriminate. They do not just target the combatants. They do not just target the evil authoritarian dictators, people like Putin, who has all of the faults that you mentioned, David. But I cannot, in good conscience, acquiesce to the killing of a single innocent human being in order to dislodge somebody who is guilty. And from my ethical framework, initiating force against a single innocent human being is not acceptable, no matter what somebody else might be doing. So how can we have an ethical approach to defense? I would say building up the missile defense capabilities is the way to go.
Very
Now,
quickly, a couple of follow-ups on that. I think there is a kind of trolley problem here. None of us want to initiate actions that will lead to people's death. But on the other hand, by inaction, we are condoning many people being killed all the time. Is that better somehow? Inaction? Well, we're not getting involved and many people are dying, but at least we're not causing that. Is that morally better than getting involved with the risk of some people being killed? I don't think that's clear, and I think we have to look at that quite carefully each time. And just one comment on the defense systems, the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative from Ronald Reagan. I think this is another case when our intuitions may lead us astray. It sounds good that, well, we will have a defensive system that will ensure that we won't be bombed by the other side. But suddenly that makes it more credible that we will be able to launch an attack ourselves. We might decide that there is reasons why we want to start an attack, and we might be so confident in our defenses that we think we can go ahead. At least that's what the Soviet Union in these days was afraid of. That was was their objection to SDI. They thought if it does work, or even if it partially works, it will lead possibly a dangerous leader of the Western alliance to commence bombing against Russia, which, after all, Ronald Reagan did ill-advisedly joke on radio about once. So although it seems that building a defensive system can have no aggressive intent, it can be perceived in that way, which is why there was for many years an ABM, an anti-ballistic missile, that missile a system to knock incoming weapons out of the sky was actually forbidden by agreement by both sides because of the destabilizing nature. So I mean, we could get a long discussion on the ins and outs of these particular issues. I just want to flag up that it's more complicated than our instincts might first suggest.
Yes, thank you, David. And we had an interesting comment by Sergei Gubkin in our chat. He says he's opposed to immediate nuclear disarmament because of the threat that Putin poses right now. But he says in the long run, we need to get rid of nukes before a psychopath rises in power in America, because America is not immune from psychopaths rising to the head of a superpower. And that is also a valid concern. But I would say we're here discussing a framework that hopefully would be implemented within these ethical boundaries. So a country that creates a superb missile defense system would also need to commit to not having offensive nuclear weapon capability, and perhaps to assuage the other nations of the world. If the United States were to do that, or if the United Kingdom were to do that, because the UK is also a nuclear power, there could be a synchronized effort to get rid of the offensive nuclear capability while building up the defenses. And of course, then it would be on us to make sure internally that we prevent a psychopath or a belligerent, aggressive leader of any sort from rising to power. And hopefully transhumanist ideas can serve as a bulwark against that happening. I certainly am of the view that the more widespread transhumanism and humanism generally is within a society, the less likely an authoritarian leader or a psychopathic or sociopathic leader would be to rise to power, because there would be a general cultural atmosphere to oppose that kind of development from happening. So now I would like to hear from Kyrtin Atreides with regard to his thoughts on the conversation thus far. Kyrtin, please go ahead.
Thank you. So following up on the conversation that y'all were having, then a missile defense system would be the TSA of solutions, because you're defending against the past. You're not defending against biological warfare. You're not defending against any weapon that has not yet been popularized. So any sufficiently advanced power source is also going to be a weapon. You can't just build a missile defense system against something like that. And mutually assured destruction has proven to be effective. You can eventually get rid of it if you have a functional global society, but humanity certainly is not there yet. What we're facing right now is essentially, it's like a game of chicken between political powers. Putin is ready to just keep driving straight because he knows that anyone else is going to veer off and get out of his way. And he's a bully. He's going to do whatever he can get away with. He did recently make the bluff that he was going to jack up the price of oil to $300 a barrel, but there are some things that even if he wants to do them are probably out of his reach. Part of the question is starting nuclear war actually out of his reach? Because right now, he wants to make everyone think that he is able to do that. Historically speaking, we've seen multiple examples of disobedience in the Russian military averting nuclear war. And pretty much everyone recognizes that if you start a nuclear war, that's game over. Your political power doesn't matter for anything at that point. And the people who would generally be doing the launching, to my understanding, are not necessarily the ones who would be surviving that. So another factor to take into consideration is that by multiple accounts, Putin's personality has changed significantly in the past 5 years. So some combination of age-related disease and mental illness seems like it could be motivating some of the extreme actions that we've seen. The actions that we've seen have included things that I couldn't have even thought of a month ago, like forcing citizens in one of the regions to take up arms and serve on the front line as cannon fodder for the Russian military, abducting citizens and taking them into Russian territory, effectively turning them into hostages. Bombing civilian targets, of course, some accounts that were possibly chemical weapons, and of course, the threat that he has done so much preparation to set up in his propaganda of biological weapons. And he has repeatedly said that he considers what NATO and other entities in the area have done is akin to declaring war. Now, whatever leeway all the countries in the area decide to give him, he is going to run with as far as he can. That is the personality that he demonstrates right now. That seems to be his political goal. So if people decide not to step in and do more in the case of Ukraine, then there are other targets that are not yet in NATO that he can go for, and he can find an excuse. He can stage whatever operations that he wants because he already has control of something like, by opinion polls, as much as 70% of the Russian population still believes him. And even with the state of his military, then if Ukraine ends and he promptly gets what he wants from China or from somewhere else, then he'll be able to recoup and just go back to it again. Look at the history of all of the wars that Russia has waged in the past couple of decades. What we've seen more recently that has been different is that he did not anticipate both the response from Ukraine, but more broadly, the response from the world. He expected probably something more akin to the sanctions that were imposed after the last incident with Crimea. And that's set him back a bit, but by no means does that mean that he's going to stop. He is legitimately crazy at this point.
Yes, thank you, Kyrtin. And I think you validly pointed out that there have been instances in the past when Soviet military officers averted possible nuclear war. For instance, there was Vasily Arkhipov in 1961, who essentially was on a submarine, a nuclear submarine, and responded to a false alarm by refusing to launch nuclear weapons. In 1983, famously, there was Stanislav Petrov, who essentially received a false alarm of nuclear weapons being launched as a result of the US Able Archer exercise, and he decided not to report it to his superiors and instead just recognized, this is most likely not a true nuclear launch. If it were a true nuclear launch, there wouldn't be like a few missiles for which the system was giving the signal. There would be thousands of them, and besides, the political tensions at that point in time did not make it look like there would be a nuclear attack. So there are good, conscientious people within the chain of command who can indeed prevent a nuclear response. However, I wonder what would happen even with similar individuals in positions of decision-making authority, if there were a false alarm tomorrow, given how elevated the tensions are. And I think one of the problems of having these nuclear arsenals, especially the strategic nuclear arsenals, the intercontinental ballistic missiles at the ready, is that if there is a false alarm, in a period of high geopolitical tensions, it is very easy for that to be misunderstood. And unless you have incredibly conscientious people in a position to avert a perceived retaliatory strike, which would actually end up being a first strike, you would have the first strike occur. And for me, that does illustrate why mutually assured destruction is literally mad. Over the long term, even if individual instances of false alarms can be rightly detected as such, I would say the probability approaches 100% that there would be some sort of accidental launch. And because the stakes are so high, we cannot allow it to happen even once. And more generally, I would say the principle is no single individual or group of people, whoever they are, whatever their positions may be, should be allowed to have the kind of power that would destroy the human species. It's the reason why we reject authoritarian governments more generally. No single person or group of people should have the power to dictate the lives of people in an entire geographical area. We need to have checks and balances. We need to have controls and restraints on any leader, any decision maker. And I think in the event of nuclear weapons, the stakes are just orders of magnitude higher than even in the worst dictatorship. And this, to me, of course, is a matter of great concern with regard to the status quo. Now, with regard to Putin and what he is likely to do, even if hypothetically he succeeds in Ukraine, though it's very difficult to see him succeeding now, because even if he wins every single engagement from this point forward, how is he going to pacify the entire country when he is just absolutely hated, including by people who would have been inclined to support him before, based on actions like the essentially peaceful annexation of Crimea? If he had done something similar, some people might have said, okay, this is not too bad. But given the immense devastation his invasion has caused, I think he's going to have a very hard time winning the peace. Moreover, his invasion has shown his conventional military to be a hollow shell of the capabilities that were previously represented. So logistically, the invasion was quite mismanaged. He has essentially used up all the resources that he originally devoted to the invasion, which is why he's now trying to hire mercenaries from Syria or pull in conscripts. And that's only going to last for a very limited amount of time as well. The problem that I see is not that if he somehow wins, he's going to expand his aggression. He doesn't have the means to expand his aggression from a conventional military perspective. The risk I actually see is of Putin losing too decisively and seeing no other way out but to escalate into a nuclear exchange. So the great danger right now is of Putin acting as if he's cornered, as if he has no other options, and he sees his fate, essentially, if he loses decisively, and his fate would be the end of his regime, the end of everything he worked for. And he is known to have the personality of a gambler. I agree with you, Kyrtin, by the way, that the recent events of the pandemic have not been helpful for his mental health, to say the least, and he is more likely to make irrational and impulsive decisions now. So if he feels that he's cornered, if he doesn't have a way out, if he doesn't have something that he can at least portray to his people as a victory for propaganda purposes, he may be tempted to lash out, perhaps start with a tactical nuclear attack on Ukraine. And then if NATO responds in any escalatory way, this could very easily turn into a strategic nuclear exchange, at which point human civilization will have a hard time of surviving at the very least. So my view, my assessment of the situation is that a negotiated peace that allows Putin to save face is actually the least existentially risky option, because at least in the short term, he can claim a victory for propaganda purposes, and the victory could be very nominal, like Ukraine commits not to join NATO and to recognize what has already been the case for 8 years, and that is Russia's annexation of Crimea and the de facto independence of the Donbas republics. Then Putin withdraws his forces to the boundaries of the status quo ante, and then essentially the dynamic that we discussed of perhaps a regime change occurring can take hold as the Russian people realize what terrible decision the invasion of Ukraine was and what devastation it brought, not just on Ukraine, but on Russia. So over time, the elites in Russia will become increasingly discontented, and the people of Russia who have already been demonstrating in mass will, I think, escalate those demonstrations. But it's wise to have a sequence of steps here. It's like in a hostage situation, and I think Putin holds the entire world hostage with his nuclear threat. First, you want to diffuse the immediate threat. You want to get as many innocent people out of the way of the hostage taker as possible. And then you figure out a way to perhaps incrementally disarm the hostage taker and make sure the hostage taker isn't a threat going forward. So I would say if Putin gets a negotiated peace now, his regime is still not going to last very long thereafter. But if he loses too decisively now, I think it is in his personality to escalate, and the consequences could be dire. So that is my outlook. I'm interested also in Edward Hudgens's outlook, and then we'll go to Dan Elton.
Thanks. This has been an excellent discussion. And by the way, I want to highlight David Wood's excellent book, which essentially tells us about, gives us some instruction about how to think about these very difficult and complex situations. So I'm a big admirer of this book as well as you, David. So I just like to call that to people's attention. And there've been a lot of good points made here. I want to mention, by the way, that in 1989 and 1990, I was actually working in Moscow and in the Baltics on conferences and meetings about transition from a dictatorship essentially and communism to free markets. And so I've actually had work on the ground over there and have kept up a lot of my contacts since then. So I have some appreciation of the situation. In the long term, ultimately, world peace is going to come more from a consensus of values. The United States and Canada really don't worry about about having wars between us, not for 200 years or so, I think. Switzerland is surrounded by NATO countries, and it's just a non-issue. The problem is that in a lot of the countries that used to be a part of the Soviet Union, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or the Soviet bloc, Poland, Czech Republic, and so on, they kind of went into like the make trade, not war approach, which of course I agree with. The problem is we know what happened in Russia. It's become a very mixed system, a very incredibly corrupt system, authoritarian system. And so to me, that's kind of going to be the long-term solution to world peace. You have to have a consensus of values growing and growing, just like the Enlightenment did. I mean, in terms of nuclear weapons, Israel is never going to give up its nuclear weapons until there is a real value change over generations in that part of the world. I mean, people who've been, the subject of exterminations for centuries are simply not going to do that. But Israel is not going out trying to aggressively attack other countries. But I want to make a couple other more limited points. And that is, I concur with a lot of what Gennady has said. Though what I'm hoping for is that at some point the military simply says we've had enough of this and basically lets people know around Putin, Mr. Putin should retire to his dacha or something like that, or frankly do what they did to Beria, which is kill him. But there's going to have to be change, I think, in the long term in Russia, whichever way the situation goes. And in terms of the global issue about nuclear weapons, right now the answer in the near future certainly is not going to be a world government. And the real reason is because we really don't have enough of a value consensus. Any of you who are interested might want to read Daniel Moynihan. Used to be the American ambassador to the UN. He later became a Democrat senator from the state of New York. He wrote an incredible book when he was the ambassador to the United Nations. It's called A Dangerous Place. And he talked about his experiences at the UN with a lot of the governments that were represented there, and they were frankly corrupt. He called Idi Amin, the head of Uganda, basically said the guy is a savage, which he was, and he got dumped on for that. The point is, you have to have enough of a consensus. One of the insights of America's founders, and by the way, of the certainly the situation in any good democratic countries, you have to have decentralization. You have to have checks and balances on power. You have to have so-called subsidiarity, meaning that in my town or my community, we handle the things we can handle here, and then things that we can't handle go up to the state level, and then things like we can't handle at the state level, like national defense, goes up to the national defense level. So certainly organizations like NATO, first of all, kept the Soviet Union from taking the rest of Western Europe, and it, of course, kept Germany and France from going to war yet again. And that was part of the reason for NATO, is to make sure that we didn't have another European war. And it has indeed succeeded. I'll give a little bit more personal background. I had a long talk. I knew Martin Anderson, who was one of Ronald Reagan's chief advisors. And when I visited Anderson, he was at Stanford at the Hoover Institute. He showed me in some detail, including a lot of videos he had and so forth, about how Reagan was obsessed with two things. Number one, government should be more limited. And number two, making sure that nuclear weapons never drop on the United States. And that's why he was interested in the Strategic Defense Initiative. And yes, there are issues with strategic defense. But one of the things, and I'm trying to remember if I'm remembering this right, I think that Reagan had discussed whether to share the technology with the Soviet Union, meaning we don't want, whether through accident or design, nuclear weapons dropping on the United States. And we understand your position. If we get rid of mutual assured destruction, then you were going to fear that we're going to nuke you. Well, maybe we'll share the technology. But I also want to say that the point about we're trying to, we're concerned about, yesterday's threats, and unfortunately there's still today's threats about nuclear weapon, doesn't say anything about a lot of the coming dangers you're going to have from technology. And I think that's a very important point that has been made in this conversation. The final thing I'll say is that this is just a preview of what's going to happen with China. Russia, in a sense, is a gas station that has nuclear weapons and a sociopath at the head of the country. And hopefully we'll be able to deal with that and avoid nuclear war. And I think we will. It's going to be much more difficult with China. China, for 40 years, did the right thing. They went from communism to some kind of a mixed system in which they really created incredible wealth. And you have millionaires and billionaires living in a communist country. But what? Everyone knows what they've done recently in terms of concentration camps for Muslims, crackdown in Hong Kong, a social credit system that's Orwell on steroids, and now basically threatening Taiwan. So that's going to be the real test, because they have nuclear weapons too. And most of our iPhones are made in China. We're much more tied in with China than we are with Russia. So we don't have the kind of leverage against China that we have against Russia. So, in terms of what we look at in the future, yes, we want Russia we want to diffuse the situation we have there. And I think it has to eventually be Putin's ouster. But we have to look ahead to China. And China's looking at the situation right now and figuring out what they can get away with and what they can't get away with. That's going to be a real challenge. But we might have an opportunity here, because so many people in China, entrepreneurs and so forth, are more attuned with an open society. They are more attuned to, frankly, the principles of transhumanism. So I think we're going to have a little bit more leverage in one sense at that values level than maybe we have in Russia, even though I have a lot of friends, that are Russian and still contacts in Russia who fortunately are, safe. So anyway, those are some initial remarks. And again, a very interesting discussion. I thank you for everyone for your input.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much, Edward, for your thoughts. And first, I would like to thank Gloria Soria from Argentina for her generous contribution once again. We greatly appreciate it. And we also had an interesting remark in the chat from David Wood, who notes, following up on Edward's comments, that Reagan had some remarkable outside-the-box thinking in his relationship with Gorbachev. Our friend John H. Points out that was largely because Gorbachev was Gorbachev, and indeed they were two remarkable individuals, both of whom were quite committed to world peace and nuclear disarmament. It was under Reagan and then George H.W. Bush that the United States reduced its nuclear stockpile about sixfold. And I think that is no small feat, considering that both the US and Soviet Union had the capability to destroy the world many times over before the disarmament in the 1980s and early 1990s. And these two people of very different persuasions, very different backgrounds, but I think a certain fundamental humanity and love of life, they were able to come to some impressive agreements that I wish could be replicated in our time. But now let us go to Dan Elton.
Thanks, Gennady. It's been a lot of really interesting comments and insights, and I'm learning a lot. I have a few comments of my own, which hopefully are, productive here. First, I think there's a risk that this conflict can be prolonged a lot longer. And really what I think personally US leadership and other people in power should be pushing for is a brokered peace agreement, because it doesn't look like Putin is going to back down. I mean, Putin is actually offering a peace deal right now with Ukraine, where, as I understand it, he is claiming he will cease hostilities if they give over the Donbass region and recognize Crimea as part of Russia, which obviously is very hard for the Ukrainians to swallow. But he is offering this deal where if they give up those territories and also basically vow never to join NATO, he would de-escalate. Now, whether you can trust Putin long term, I don't know. But what I do know is what seems clear to me is that if they don't take this peace deal, Putin will continue what he's doing. And just given the numbers involved, when you look at the Russian army versus the Ukrainian army, eventually the Russian army will win. And my concern is if they don't take this peace deal now, there'll be a lot of unnecessary bloodshed in a much longer protracted war, which honestly I don't really see the Ukrainians being able to win, and I don't think that Putin would give up. He seems to be just escalating and escalating, and unfortunately, the West has kind of already used up most of their economic sanctions. So he's kind of, as you said, he's backed in a corner, and yeah. So I'm curious what people think about that. I have another point, which is building off of what Edward just said. We need to be looking at the longer term geopolitical implications. And part of that is, first of all, Russia is going to be more isolated, which is dangerous. And, I've been thinking about the famous quote from Bastia, where he said, you know, if goods do not cross borders, soldiers will. So when the world is more interconnected and more interdependent, war is less likely. When you have countries that are become more isolated and economically isolated, that's dangerous. And that's kind of the world we're heading into now. It's a new geopolitical reality where Russia is way more isolated. So that's one point, and that, you know, looking long term. And then the other point is looking at China. I think we need to be looking at the risks of China invading Taiwan. So I think that's an important thing to discuss as well, because you know, right now we're very reliant on semiconductors from Taiwan, for instance. That's going a little off tangent from the focus of this panel, but it's an important consideration. So I'm curious what people think. And my final point is, I think we need to watch the rhetoric here in the U.S. because unfortunately we have Republicans that are ramping up their rhetoric. We have Republicans like Senator Rick Scott from Florida calling for no-fly zone now, and they're trying to use this for political gain by making Biden look weak, and it's extremely reckless behavior. And I'm afraid that as you know, they feel emboldened by public opinion now. Gennady mentioned some public opinion polling that is, quite frankly, terrifying. I mean, it's kind of terrifying that so many people would support a no-fly zone, and now we have Republicans calling for it. It seems like, you know, the people in charge, like Biden and everyone, are not going to do that. But I think we need to just try to tone down the rhetoric. And I'd love to hear what people think about those points.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan. And we have some feedback from our viewers in the chat as well. Pam Keefe writes that they should take the deal. It's a reasonable solution, they meaning the Ukrainian side. And Daniel Twett writes that is a somewhat reasonable peace deal. And I agree, and I have said as much during our previous Virtual Enlightenment Salon on de-escalating this conflict.
I have one other point I forgot, which is with regard to the peace deal. My understanding is just, I'm not an expert in international relations or anything, but just from what I've heard, it was never very likely that Ukraine was going to join NATO anyway. So
that's correct.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's hard for the Ukrainians to swallow is giving up those parts of their territory, right?
Yes.
But I think just looking at the reality of the military situation, if they can stop it now, they can avoid a lot of bloodshed.
Yes, absolutely. And these kinds of territorial transfers or commitments not to join a particular organization, they are bloodless. And territories have changed hands throughout history. That's not necessarily going to be accompanied by bloodshed, but each life lost is irreversible. And that's the greatest tragedy, I think, in this entire situation. I'd like to thank John H. Just a moment. I'd like to thank John H. for his contribution via our super chat. And he also writes that a no-fly zone is a non-starter in his view. I agree with that, but go ahead, Edward.
No, I was just going to say, and this certainly highlights something that David Wood said, is that in the Budapest Accord, Ukraine agreed to give up its nukes. And it's very explicit that the parties to this agreement, which included Russia, the United States, I think the UK was on there as well, agreed to recognize Ukraine's borders and to not use military force against it. And it's explicitly in, I believe it's the Budapest Accord. I don't have the year right offhand, but that was the provision that allowed that under which the Ukrainians gave up the nukes that they had. So in terms of Putin being trustworthy, well, there it is.
Well, actually, the Budapest Agreement was signed in 1994, so under Yeltsin.
That's right. Yeah,
and
that was under Yeltsin, true. But I think it was meant to be Russia, not just the particular guy in charge right now. That's a good point.
Oh, sure, sure. And I do think we can question the trustworthiness of Putin. Now, the question is, though, if such an agreement is reached, is Putin going to have time to violate it? That is to say, if the risks of violation are primarily a few years out, we will have bought ourselves a few years of time for the political situation in Russia to change. So my inclination is to say anything that stops the current conflict is going to so dramatically lower the existential risks facing humanity that essentially the probability of future conflicts of this magnitude arising would be very low. But on the other hand, the probability of the current conflict escalating into full-fledged nuclear war is uncomfortably high. And when people respond to Dan's comments, I would also be interested in your respective assessments of what the probability of nuclear war would be now from the current vantage point based on what we know. And I understand this is highly subjective and approximate, but I think it would be helpful to kind of get a general gauge of how likely that possibility is perceived among the group here. So in my view, the risk of nuclear war from the current vantage point is somewhere in the vicinity of 10%. And that's much higher than it has ever been in human history. And for me, even a 0.1% probability is far too high. Of course, I want to reduce it to 0, but 10% has led me to make contingency plans. I have actively looked for areas in the United States which would be at lowest risk of damage from a nuclear strike or nuclear fallout, and have started essentially planning what I would do in the event a no-fly zone is declared over Ukraine. So that's my assessment, but I'd be interested in other people's assessments along with your response to Dan's comments about the peace deal that has been offered. So any of the panelists feel free to begin.
I'll go. Yeah, I think there's been a lot of disinformation going around. In my social media, I've seen a lot of people who were normally on the left, now they've become warmongering hawks. And the people who were on the right have now become doves. And yeah, it almost seems like there's been a Mandela effect flippening. Zelensky has become this global alpha. And I think he's just as much a psychopath as Putin. And, there was an interview I saw from Colonel Doug McGregor. He says that the population, Putin has 70% support in Russia, and that we're being, pointed in a different direction by the bias in Western media. Right now, he says that the Azov battalion is keeping civilians from leaving Kiev because Russia had given them safe access out of there, but the battalion doesn't want them to leave because they're sort of going to use them as human shields. So I think we do need, the West should have done more to get a broker that peace deal, not pass a bill of $13.5 billion for aid and military equipment. But from what I hear, they're not going to be able to get any equipment in there because the Russians already control all ports of entry. So everything they have has already been given to them months and years ago, and this bill is just to account for all of that. And yeah, I think Zelensky wants to drag out this war, and I think he wants people to die, and I think he wants to create direct conflict between the U.S. and Russia. So I don't know how we can get him to change his mind. I think it's all about him right now. I know Putin's got issues, but Zelensky has taken this mantle of being at the top. He's addressed our Congress, and round of applause to him. And I think all Putin wants, is NATO neutrality, to cede those areas, the Donbass areas, and to quit persecuting a lot of the ethnic Russians on the eastern side. So I think that we've been misinformed here on the West. I have friends who are Serbian and they listen to the Serbian news, and they agree with a lot of what Colonel Douglas McGregor has said.
Yes, thank you, Art Ramon. So what probability would you assign to a nuclear war happening given the present situation? And again, it doesn't have to be a precise answer, just your best guess.
I'd say less than 50. I don't think Putin would ever launch nukes, and neither would the US, but there are plenty of other conventional weapons that we can definitely use at each other. So it's gonna, I think Zelensky just wants to create that direct conflict and somehow be at the middle. So yeah, I think he's a psychopath. He's no different than Putin.
The story that your friends are getting, one question, is that the same story that's coming from Putin? Because if it's coming from Putin, if it's the same propaganda line, then it's probably not true.
Yeah, they're getting it from Serbian news. So they say that a lot of the sites on the east are being censored. They can't get to it, but Serbian news isn't being censored. So they're getting better facts on the ground over there in Serbia. So that's what they tell me.
That's what I'm wondering, what's true. I just, if the narcissist is telling you that that's probably not true.
I mean, yeah, and I would just say, I mean, there's been some news reports that Zelensky is just the past few days. There's been news reports suggesting that he's close to taking a deal, and he doesn't strike me as someone that wants to die. His life is in danger. I mean, he there's been assassination attempts on him, so it's in his personal interest to end this war, and hopefully that's what will happen. But I don't know. We'll see.
Yes, and it's interesting too. Zelensky had this very impassioned speech prior to the invasion, trying to convince the Russian people that war is a bad idea. So I don't see him as having provoked the war in any sense. Now, his position as the war is ongoing is a bit strange, and I would say not always conducive to a fast peace being reached, because one, he wants his government to survive, and of course the fastest path to peace would have been for him to capitulate completely, and he would not have wanted to do that. He wants to mount some sort of effective resistance in order to gain more concessions at the negotiating table. So if Putin had quickly conquered the major cities of Ukraine, Zelensky's position would be a lot weaker. And it does seem to me that he has made some overtures toward peace recently. For instance, he has said he wants to speak with Putin directly. He has made comments like, well, NATO has chosen not to provide a no-fly zone for the Ukrainians, so what good are they? We can defend ourselves without NATO. So I think he was kind of preparing the stage for the Ukrainian side to accept the commitment not to join NATO. So that's my assessment. I think the Ukrainian side has probably prolonged this too far by not being willing to acquiesce to what I think is a reasonable peace offer, which is no NATO membership, recognition of Russian annexation of Crimea, and recognition of the Donbas republics. But I think Zelensky may be holding out for an even better deal where it would be something like no NATO membership for Ukraine and Russia withdraws its forces.
All that might be a red herring, though. All that stuff, like Putin, the stuff that he thinks he wants, he might not even want none of that. That might be a lie. He don't want to recognize
Yeah,
wants
I'm
it all.
curious.
You know? I mean, this whole idea that that Putin didn't want him in NATO, that was just a smokescreen. They were never going to get in NATO. That was never an issue. So,
Agreed.
These giving him appeasement isn't really going to work. He's still going to keep going. And even if there was to get some kind of deal, and he gets the Donbass and he gets this and that, why would he stop?
Jason, Jason's points are right. He's already threatened the Baltics. I mean, he's already threatened the Baltics, and he's talked about the Soviet Union falling apart was this worst catastrophe. And if he just wanted to make sure Russians were protected, well, okay, that's a valid discussion. But we're dealing with a ex-KGB agent who has a very different view of the world than we do.
We have some very interesting comments from our friends at Immortalist magazine. And this comment says, unfortunately, Zelensky is willing to die. He has said it a few times. What is worrisome is he seems not to care if the rest of the world doesn't want to die. And I agree, the calls for a no-fly zone have been irresponsible, with one possible exception of how they could be interpreted. Perhaps Zelensky knew that NATO would reject the call for a no-fly zone, and his repeated insistence on it was intended to set the stage for him to be able to tell the Ukrainian people that, oh, NATO is no good, it can't help us, so we might as well concede to not become a member of NATO. So if he's clever like that, that may be a useful tactic, but if he is sincere about wanting to risk World War III because of essentially the desire to close the Ukrainian sky, then that is a bit reckless. Also, this is a comment from Zelensky that I read as well today that Immortalist magazine brought to our attention. He said, I'm ready for negotiations with Putin, but if they fail, it could mean a third world war. And it's not clear what he means here, whether that's just a factual assessment of how the conflict could escalate, or if he's willing to risk a third world war if the negotiations break down in some manner. So I'll leave that to our viewers to decide. Before we continue the discussion, I wanted to get Jason's assessment of the probability of nuclear war from our current vantage point.
Well, first off, I wanted to mention that I think the whole no-fly zone thing is sort of like deceptive in a way. I mean, we don't really mean no-fly zone. What we really mean is go in there and fight. Take your planes in there, because that's the only thing that you can enforce, a no-fly zone. That so it's not like, it means go there, fight. So by saying it's just a no-fly zone, that's deceptive in a way. What they really mean is go to war. But as far as the risk, I wonder just how many people need to have their finger on the button over there in Russia. I mean, how many people got to be there to allow him to be crazy if he just went off the deep end and was wanting to launch a nuke? What's the procedure there? Is it do they got the same kind of procedures as the U.S.? I'm guessing, but
well, in both situations, the president has the unilateral authority to order a nuclear strike. Now, there's a sequence where certain officers have to actually launch the missiles, and so hypothetically, somebody could say the president is not in a sound state of mind. We don't agree with this, but they would be openly insubordinate at that point in time. But both Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin have the ability to decide to destroy the world right now. And that, to me, is quite frightening. So I'd be interested in the assessments of everyone on the panel. What is the probability that something like this might happen? David Wood?
It's a very good question. And I would think it's less than 1%, the probability that there's a global nuclear war this year. Of course, Putin wants people to think it's much higher than that, because if he can make people think it's much higher, they're going to give him what he asks for. They're going to stand back. Why do I think it's a bit lower? It's still too high, by the way. I mean, it's probably more than 1 in 1,000, so it is a very dangerous situation on the whole. But why don't I think it's higher? Well, I don't think Putin's entirely mad. He wants people to think he's mad, but he is self-interested to an extent. And secondly, there are people around him, a bit like General Mark Milley in the US, who at one stage, I believe, he basically said to other generals, look, if Donald Trump does something really mad in his last few weeks in office, we're going to stop him from doing something mad. I can't remember the details. So they talked independently to some of the opposite numbers in other major countries. So I think some of the people around Putin are going to act in the ultimate moment in some defensive way. And Putin doesn't want to initiate a nuclear war. He just wants to give people the impression that he might initiate a nuclear war, so we'd better negotiate with him. In terms of what Dan was offering is the possible basis for a negotiation, I agree we have to be open-minded here, but I'm very reluctant to say, right, these parts of Ukraine, we're going to hand them over. It's a little bit like the great powers of old at the Congress of Vienna in 1815 or Treaty of Versailles in 1919, dividing up the world and without the involvement of the people concerned. We are better than that nowadays. We believe in self-determination. So I think it's entirely fair to accept Putin's request that the people should make their own mind up. And if they really do in a fair election say they want to become part of Russia, then we should accept that. But we should not take it on board that simply because a few people with a loud voice in these districts are calling for belonging to Russia, that is the right decision. What has happened in the Donbass is had lots of Russian nationals move there, a bit like China did in Tibet, in Lhasa. When I visited Lhasa a while ago, there were many Han people there rather than the original Tibet people. So, of course, this is polarizing. But I would guess even many of the Russian speakers in these regions, given a free choice, a really free choice, they would probably say they would prefer to stick with Ukraine. Why? Because becoming part of Russia, so long as Putin remains in charge, means giving up some key human rights. So I would say, yeah, there are things that Zelensky should be prepared to give up, but he should not give up parts of his country without independently observed plebiscite in these areas. In terms of comparing Putin and Zelensky, what I will point out is there are many other leaders in Ukraine who come across also often on media, speaking very articulately and passionately about the need for their country to be protected. I saw this morning on the BBC interview with Deputy Prime Minister, a woman who was very articulate, very thoughtful, great emotional intelligence. And then there's the former president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, who was president from 2014 to 2019. He's been on the media a lot too, also backing up. This is not just a one-man thing. It is not just an aberration by Zelensky. And in any case, I don't see him as being in the slightest bit psychopathic. He has immense emotional intelligence. And of course, he is saying some things to try and frighten other people as well. Hence his talk about, well, maybe there'll be a third world war, so therefore we'd better hurry up with the negotiation. So to really find out the background of Putin, I strongly recommend a book called Putin's People by Kyrtin Belton, who was the Financial Times correspondent in Russia for many, many years. She has interviewed an enormous number of former regime members, oligarchs. It is a comprehensive piece of work, and it is flabbergasting the amount of data and evidence she has gathered of terrible things that Putin did on his rise to power, how he initiated attacks on his own people, false flag attacks, which he blamed on Chechnya, the terrible attack on the theater, which again was blamed on Chechnya. There's lots of evidence that Kyrtin Belton organizes that these were false flag operations designed to bolster Putin's prestige inside Russia. So people should read that before they offer any glib comparison between Putin and any other leader. Putin is at least an order of magnitude worse than any leader on the West, maybe 2 orders of magnitude worse. And if we're not aware of this, then we'll just come across as naive and out of touch, and people won't seriously pay attention to our recommendations. We must know what's going on rather than just being wishful thinking.
All right, thank you, David. And we have our friend Didier Cornell in our YouTube chat who writes that he sadly disagrees with David Wood here. He says, quote, "I think the chances of a nuclear war decided by Putin are small, but the chances of a nuclear war started because of the tensions and by mistake are higher than ever since 1983. So I think he partially agrees with you, David, in that he doesn't think Putin would actually launch a nuclear first strike, but he thinks the tensions are so high that perhaps either the American side might misperceive Putin as having launched a first strike, or Putin might misperceive NATO as having launched a first strike, and therein lies the greater threat. I'm inclined to agree that Putin probably doesn't want a nuclear war either, for all of his faults. He would prefer to stay in power as the leader of an intact Russia. But I think at this point, there is a worrying possibility of the situation running away from everybody's ability to contain unless we implement massive de-escalation now. So
I got a quick question. Does Russia have like the internet wall like China has?
Well, it's a bit more porous than that. So until very recently, Russia was connected to all of the Western internet platforms. And only in the past few weeks has Russia tried to ban access to its people from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And even then, people have VPNs, and they're able to get around those bans much more effectively than circumventing the Great Firewall of China. Keep in mind, until very recently, Russia was quite integrated with the West, both economically and culturally, and that had served as a check to Putin's authoritarian regime. There were a lot of opposition bloggers and YouTubers and even news stations that tried, up until the very restrictive censorship laws were enacted, to show the truth about the situation in Ukraine. But now the recent censorship edicts essentially prohibit even calling this war a war, which is troubling. But when Kyrtin said, for instance, 70% of Russians claim that they support this invasion, what they support is what the propaganda tells them about this invasion, that it's a limited special military operation that doesn't target civilians at all, and that it's meant to denazify Ukraine. If they're not given access to alternative media sources, then it's difficult for them to make up their minds objectively based on the evidence. Now, I would be interested to hear David Pearce's assessment of the possible peace deal that has been discussed, as well as the probability of a nuclear war materializing from the current circumstances.
Yes, I think Vladimir Putin needs to be given the opportunity to declare victory and take the troops home. It is tempting but simplistic to say that Vladimir Putin is a psychopath. I mean, even someone like Joseph Stalin, who killed millions of people. Nonetheless, recently a book on Stalin's library has been produced, and essentially Stalin was a devout Marxist-Leninist. He was sort of annotating these texts. In the case of Vladimir Putin, he said he's a devout Russian nationalist who catastrophically miscalculated, and until the invasion, he had been ruthless but very astute. But all the indications are that essentially, yes, he completely miscalculated. The Russian propaganda machine didn't kick into gear initially. At least essentially Russia thought it was just going to be able to essentially take over Ukraine within a few days or at most a week or two, and they have been confounded. So yeah, it sticks in the craw, and it would stick in the craw if I were President Zelensky or Ukrainian patriots. But essentially, we've got the nucleus of a peace deal, and I think that is going to be the way forward, because the longer this conflict goes on, the higher the likelihood I think nuclear weapons will be used. Do I think Vladimir Putin, for example, would be prepared to authorize so-called tactical nuclear weapons if Russia were in danger of being defeated? There would be some pretext. This is the one thing, because conflict in the Ukraine has aspects of a civil war, because yes, obviously Ukraine-Russian history intimately connected. Things can spiral completely out of control, massacres, atrocities, and so yes, it is vital that cooler heads prevail. That yes, all possible pressure is brought to bear for a peace settlement. Yeah, I wouldn't. Essentially, in President Zelensky's position, yeah, this temptation to want to bring the rest of the world, it's entirely humanly understandable. But if there is a peace, some kind of peace deal available, I think we should go for it. That said, I should probably stress that just as a couple of years ago, like most people, I reinvented myself as a virologist, immunologist, and so on. I'm not an expert in international relations, but yeah, I tend to agree with Gennady, sadly, that the likelihood of nuclear conflict could be as high as 10, even 15%. It's very, very difficult to quantify this, but it's scary.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, David. And I agree that it is scary. And I agree that this nucleus of a peace deal that we've discussed should definitely be explored further in good faith by all sides. Now, on the subject of self-determination that David Wood mentioned, I think, of course, the Ukrainian side should be and has been actively involved in the negotiations, and they would ultimately need to be the decision makers in terms of whether to take this deal or not. I just hope that conversations from outside of Ukraine, like this one, may sway their decision in the interests of attaining world peace. Now, let's go to Edward. Edward, what do you think is the probability of a nuclear exchange, and do you think that this peace deal that has been discussed is worth exploring further?
Well, I think the possibility is lower than you think, maybe a little bit higher than what David Wood thinks. I think David Wood's points are very well made, and the point that Putin might be have no concern about human life, as he clearly is in Ukraine, and when he was a KGB agent sponsoring terrorists in Germany, clearly doesn't care particularly about human life, but I think a lot of this is bluff and a way of getting away with what he's doing in Ukraine. So I'd say it's more like maybe 4%. And again, it would have to be one of these things where he authorizes starting with maybe tactical nukes in Ukraine. But again, I think that he realizes that would be a major escalation. And that's where the military, which is not particularly happy with what he's done and the situation that he's put the military in. I think at that point, when he starts ordering that sort of thing, this is where the generals say, okay, we've had enough of this, because they don't want to particularly get involved in a massive nuclear war. So I think it's lower than I think. In terms of the agreement, the whole pretext of, well, it's because you're thinking of joining NATO because you're afraid we might invade you. Therefore, we're going to invade you and teach you a lesson that you were wrong. It's kind of like the Islamists who held up signs basically saying, behead those who say Islam, is not a religion of peace. I mean, it's nutty. That's what I think. It was just an excuse because the Ukraine wasn't going to get into NATO anyway. And if they got into NATO and Russia wasn't interested in invading them, well, what's the problem? But they weren't going to get in anyway. In terms of the rest of the agreement, I think a plebiscite idea is a good idea. We don't want a situation like David Wood mentioned a few of them, and I'll mention Munich in 1938, where basically the great powers got together and decided to give Sudetenland to Hitler. The Czechs weren't in on any of this. It was just, well, there's a lot of Germans there. Hitler is this bully, and we just want to shut him up, and we don't want to have a war, so let's just give him the Sudetenland. And then, of course, he took the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then the next time he decided he wanted part of Poland, World War II broke out. And so I don't want to see us basically do something like that. But again, if we allow a plebiscite, if that's part of the deal, then I think that Putin can say, well, at least I've got something out of this. And I think Zelensky can say, look, we're for self-determination. So why not just go ahead and do it that way? And I want to remind people that, for example, in the United States, on a number of occasions, the Puerto Ricans have voted on whether to become an American state or not. Right now, they're an American Commonwealth. And so they enjoy a lot of the advantages of being American citizens, but there's some things they don't enjoy. And I think that's right. And I think a lot of the Russians in those areas would say, well, we could be part of the authoritarian Putin regime, or we could maybe be part of Ukraine, or maybe even better, what about some sort of a federated system in Ukraine, where maybe they're still part of Ukraine, but just like American states and Swiss cantons have a lot of local power, maybe you have an arrangement like that. And I'm not familiar with exactly the situation right now in Ukraine, but that seems to me would be a peaceful situation. Putin would get something out of it, and Zelensky would basically say, look, I can go with that. So I would say something like that. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe I should start writing some pieces about that as a possible solution. So that's my thinking of that. But right now, I'm not as worried about the nuclear threat, though it's something we have to take seriously. But what I am concerned about is the reason we're having this whole discussion is there's a particular individual who's in charge in Moscow, and his name is Putin, and he wants to reestablish something like the Russian Empire, and he's threatening the Baltics, for example, that they don't even speak anything close to Russian. They've been independent, for quite a long time. And yet he's threatening them. Belarus, of course, is already a tyranny, so that's a sort of a different issue. But I think that the negotiations over some kind of federated republic and a plebiscite would be a very good approach. And I think Zelensky could swallow that, because he could say, look, that we're letting the people speak, which is what he says he wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Edward. And certainly that kind of outcome is within the spectrum of possibilities. I would say the spectrum of realistic possibilities would span from, on the one hand, just a pure promise of Ukraine not to join NATO, and that's it, and Putin withdraws. And that's if the war goes really well for the Ukrainian side. And the other side of the spectrum is the concession of the territories that have been discussed. But your option is in the middle. So definitely one of the realistic possibilities that should be looked at. I want to acknowledge David Shoemaker and his kind contribution. And he writes, "Glory to Ukraine." Thank you, David, for your support, as always. And now I would like to ask Newton Lee for his assessment of the situation, the possibilities for a peace deal, as well as the probability of a nuclear conflict from the current vantage point.
Yes, thank you, Gennady. So first of all, peace negotiation is very important. Obviously, we don't want any more suffering. We don't want any more destructions. But should we sacrifice Ukraine in order to, so to speak, prevent a third world war, prevent a nuclear war? I'm not sure. because Ukraine stands for democracy. So the deeper question, the moral question is, do we allow democracy to be destroyed by someone, right? That's a very important question. Now, weapons of mass destruction are not just nuclear bombs. They're biological and chemical weapons as well. And in fact, some biological weapons are much worse than COVID that the world have seen in the past couple of years. And also, we should not underestimate psychological information warfare. It's not just physical fighting, but also a lot of psychological information going on. Misinformation, disinformation, all kinds of things that we need to take care of. So that is why total information awareness is very important. It can play a major role in preventing a World War III, preventing nuclear destructions or nuclear wars. So in terms of world peace, I really like David Pearce's idea on all women world leaders. That is controversial, but if you look at Finland, right, we have Finland has a female president and all female cabinet. So it's something that's interesting. But of course, Finland is a democratic society, so it's probably easier to implement than some other countries. But that's something that we can look forward to.
Yes, thank you.
What about people who define themselves as women? We just had a major swimming meet where a guy who declared himself to be a woman won. So I think you get into a lot of problems with that.
So would Putin instrumentally define himself as female to get around that kind of restriction? I don't know, but it's interesting with regard to Finland because the prime minister, Sanna Marin, is female, as Newton pointed out. The president, Sauli Niinisto, is male. And he is actually a kind of confidant of Putin. So they have good relations between the two of them, and they converse very often. And Sauli Niinisto was recently interviewed by Christiane Amanpour briefly, and he related a conversation that he had with Putin, essentially asking him, well, what happens if NATO escalates? What happens if there's a no-fly zone over Ukraine? What happens if the politicians in the West are pressured by their people to declare a no-fly zone? And Putin just responded ominously, well, then terrible things will happen. And I think Sauli Niinisto was saying this is very plausible behavior coming from Putin, and he knows Putin very well. So this is one reason why I take any threat from Putin very seriously. But now I want to get Kyrtin's assessment of the possible peace deal options that have been discussed, as well as the probability of a nuclear exchange from our current vantage point. We have a little less than 3 minutes left in our salon, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this, Kyrtin.
I'll try to be concise then. It's important to remember that no existential risk exists in isolation. All of them are connected to one another. You have a cascade risk where if the risk of one increases, it can also increase other risks. So if a deal goes through that is too good for Putin, then there is still some risk that could give the green light to others like him around the world. As David Wood pointed out, there aren't many that could live up to that terrible standard, but there are still a few. Now, if you wanted to see China getting the green light to go for Taiwan and cause even more destruction, then that's certainly a possibility if things went too well for Putin. They might not be at a point where that's even possible anymore, considering the losses that he's taken. But I would say that if the peace deal is genuine and there is some reasonable version of it that can be accepted, then the odds of nuclear war are perhaps 1% or less. If it's not genuine, which it's entirely possible that it's just another psychological warfare mechanism for him, then perhaps 5% in and of itself. What I would say actually is Zelensky is a good example of a comedian becoming a wartime president, which it turns out is a pretty good combination. I stay away from social media, but I monitor news from 6 different countries, and there's been nothing legitimate that has shown him to be anything other than well-motivated and a pretty good leader. What I would recommend in place for no-fly zone, though, is applying Sun Tzu's Art of War. If you're going to beat somebody like Putin, you have to be smarter than he is in tactical terms. If NATO had a spine, which they don't, and they've demonstrated that quite thoroughly now, then Ukraine is holding off the Russian military. The NATO forces, without going nuclear, could steamroll over the rest of it, and that's without using nuclear forces. It's a mistake to think that any military action automatically escalates to nuclear war between powers who can do so. It's easy to lapse into that fear, but it's irrational.
Well, I do think we're dealing with an individual in the form of Vladimir Putin who is less than fully rational, but he has his own rationale in his mind that he adheres to. And I think he is capable of escalating at least to a tactical nuclear war if he perceives the other side, however defined, to have conventional military supremacy. So that is what I'm concerned about. But I thank you for your assessment. It looks like most of the panelists consider the current risk of nuclear war to be less than 10%. I am still in the vicinity of 10% in terms of my estimate, but I hope I'm wrong. And I hope those of you who have more favorable outlook are correct. So unfortunately, while we've had a robust discussion, our time today is at an end, but I really appreciate everybody's points of view and the free and open conversation that we've had, precisely the kind of conversation that would not be possible in an authoritarian regime or in any sort of environment of wartime censorship. I hope we never get to that. And I hope we can continue having these exchanges every Sunday at 1 p.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Eastern time. Until next time, live long and prosper.